Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen fireworks above the ballroom, scattering light across polished marble floors and diamond-studded smiles. Soft instrumental music floated through the air, the kind meant to soothe egos and drown out insecurities. Men in tailored suits laughed too loudly. Women in designer gowns smiled too carefully. Everything about the company gala was meant to say, "Successia." Standing there with a drink I barely touched, all I felt was how painfully out of place I was. I had worn my best suit, pressed it twice, practiced polite conversation in my head. Still, I felt like a guest who had wandered into a room meant for someone else. Power lived here, money breathed here, and I was just another employee pretending he belonged. My wife stood beside me, elegant as always. The deep blue of her dress caught the light with every movement, drawing glances from people who didn't know her the way I did. She smiled when spoken to, nodded at conversations she wasn't part of. But there was a distance in her posture I couldn't explain. Not cold, just guarded, as if she were bracing herself for something. I told myself I was imagining it. Big events always made her quiet. Big events always made me nervous. That was all. Then I saw him. Rohan Mehta moved through the crowd with the ease of a man who owned every room he entered. My boss, the regional director, a man whose approval could shape careers and whose disapproval could erase them. People leaned toward him instinctively, hungry for attention, validation, opportunity. When he smiled at you, it felt intentional. When he ignored you, it felt personal. I watched him approach us, glass in hand, wearing that familiar confident grin. He greeted me first, a firm handshake, a nod that reminded me subtly of my place. Then his attention shifted to my wife. It was supposed to be harmless, a polite greeting, a compliment, something forgettable. Instead, he leaned in. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Not enough to cause a scene. Just enough that his mouth came close to her ear, his voice lowered into a private space that didn't belong to him. The whisper lasted only seconds, but my wife's reaction didn't. Her shoulders stiffened. Her smile vanished as if someone had flipped a switch. Her fingers tightened around her clutch so hard her knuckles went pale. And when Rohan pulled back, still smiling like nothing had happened, she didn't look at me. Not once. Time slowed in a way I had never experienced before. The music faded into a dull hum. The room felt smaller, hotter. My chest tightened, breath caught somewhere between my ribs. I wanted to ask her right there. Right then, what did he say? I wanted to look at Rohan and demand an explanation he would never give. But I didn't. I smiled. I nodded. I played my role, because scenes don't belong at galas. Because power has witnesses. Because fear is quiet. The rest of the evening passed in fragments. Applause I didn't remember. Conversations I didn't hear. I kept glancing at my wife, searching her face for reassurance, for something familiar. She avoided my eyes with careful precision, as if they burned. When we finally left, the night air outside felt heavier than the ballroom. The ride home was silent in a way that screamed. No music, no small talk, just the sound of traffic and thoughts I couldn't stop. I waited for her to speak. She didn't. I rehearsed questions in my head and swallowed every one of them. Accusations felt too sharp. Curiosity felt too dangerous. So I said nothing, staring out the window while my mind replayed that moment on a ruthless loop. The whisper, the tightening of her hand. At home, she changed quietly and went to bed without a word. I stood in the living room, still in my suit, feeling like I had returned from a place that had taken something from me without asking. Sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again. Not what he said, but what it did. The way it altered the air between us. The way it planted a question I couldn't uproot. I lay awake until dawn, listening to her breathing beside me, wondering how two people could be so close and suddenly feel miles apart. By morning, one truth had settled deep in my chest, heavy and undeniable. That whisper didn't end at the gala. It followed us home. The days that followed the gala didn't explode the way I half expected them to. There were no dramatic confrontations, no sudden confessions, no undeniable proof crashing into my life. Instead, everything changed quietly, so quietly that if I hadn't been living inside it, I might have missed it altogether. My wife became careful, not distant in an obvious way, not cold or cruel, just guarded, as if every word she spoke had passed through a filter before reaching me. She smiled when I talked, nodded at the right moments, asked about my day like she always had, but something in her eyes stayed alert, watchful, like someone afraid of saying the wrong thing. Her phone never left her side. It used to lie face up on the table, buzzing with notifications she'd laugh about or ignore. Now it stayed locked, screen down, close to her hand. When it vibrated, she glanced at it quickly and silenced it without reading. When I walked into a room, she tilted it away without realizing she was doing it. I noticed everything, and I hated myself for it. Conversations between us began to feel scripted. Safe topics, familiar jokes repeated like lines from a play we both knew too well. If I tried to drift into anything deeper, plans, feelings, the space I felt growing between Uschi redirected smoothly, almost expertly. It was like talking to someone who had already prepared her answers. At night, the distance grew louder. There was no argument, no refusal, no clear rejection, just excuses wrapped in exhaustion. Long days, headaches, early mornings. I told myself this was normal. life got busy, love evolved. Still, lying beside her in the dark, I felt like I was reaching across a widening gap, my hand closing on air. At work, the shift was impossible to ignore. Rohan smiled at me more than usual, slapped my shoulder in front of others, praised my work in meetings where he used to barely acknowledge my presence. He approved requests I had expected him to question, granted favors I hadn't asked for. It should have felt good. Instead, it made my skin crawl. The friendliness felt deliberate, almost performative. And when we were alone, the tone changed. His authority sharpened. Instructions came wrapped in politeness, but carried an edge subtle reminders of who held the power. It was like he was balancing something invisible, making sure I stayed grateful and unsure at the same time. I started questioning myself in ways I never had before. Was I being paranoid? Was I projecting my own insecurity onto innocent moments? Was this what love looked like after years together? Quiet, predictable, unremarkable? I remembered our early days, without trying. Late-night conversations that spilled into morning. Laughter over cheap meals. The certainty we had in each other. So effortless, it felt unbreakable. Back then, she had looked at me like I was enough. Like the world outside didn't matter as long as we were together. Now I wondered when that look had faded. Or if I was the only one who felt its absence. More than once, I almost asked. The words rose to my throat while we sat across from each other at dinner, while she brushed her hair in front of the mirror, while we lay awake in the dark. Each time, I swallowed them. Because once spoken, questions like that don't come back. Because doubt, once voiced, becomes real. And because some part of me was afraid of the answer. Afraid that my love had blind spots. Afraid that trust could be misplaced. Afraid that I wasn't enough anymore, not as a husband, not as a man. The confirmation didn't come as a revelation. It came as a whisper again. At work, passing by a conference room, I heard Rohan's voice through the glass, low and familiar. Another voice answered him, softer, hurried. I didn't catch the words clearly. Just the tone, just the urgency. Just the way my name surfaced briefly, then disappeared. Later that evening, an email notification flashed across my screen sent by mistake, recalled too late. A meeting scheduled. A name included that didn't need to be. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, my chest tightening with a feeling I couldn't yet name. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew this much. Something was wrong. I chose my moment carefully, not in anger, not in accusation. I waited for a night when the house was quiet, when dinner had been cleared and the television murmured in the background like white noise meant to soften difficult conversations. I sat beside her, close enough to feel familiar, far enough not to feel desperate. My voice didn't shake when I spoke. About the gala, I said, keeping my eyes on the muted screen. When Rohan leaned in and said something to you, what was that about? She didn't answer immediately. That pause, almost invisible, hit harder than any denial could have. She exhaled, turned toward me, and frowned slightly, as if I had just asked something unreasonable. Why are you bringing this up now? She asked. I shrugged, careful not to sound defensive. It's been on my mind. Her expression tightened. Not guilty, not apologetic, annoyed. He was just making a comment about work. You know how these corporate things are. What kind of comment? I asked. She shook her head and let out a small laugh, soft, dismissive. Ion, you're overthinking this. It was nothing. Nothing. The word landed like a verdict. I waited for more. For clarity, for reassurance. It didn't come. Instead, she stood up, began stacking dishes that were already clean, her movements sharp and restless. You've been acting strange since that night, she continued. Distant, quiet. If something's bothering you, say it, but don't turn it into something it isn't. I felt my chest tighten. I'm not turning it into anything. I just want to understand. She turned then, eyes hard in a way I hadn't seen before. There's nothing to understand. You're imagining things. Imagining, that word stayed with me long after the conversation ended. It echoed in my head while she went about her routine, while the house settled into silence, while I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I replayed the gala again, her stiffened posture, her averted eyes, the way she had clutched her purse like a lifeline. Had I really misread all of it? I started questioning my memory. Maybe her smile had faded for another reason. Maybe Rohan had said something harmless, and I had projected my own insecurities onto the moment. Maybe the distance I felt was mine alone. At work, Rohan seemed to sense the shift inside me. He called me into his office more often, spoke slowly, carefully, as if explaining things to someone who needed extra guidance. Complimented me in front of others, then corrected me in private over minor details that had never mattered before. Once, as I stood to leave, he smiled and said, "You've seemed distracted lately. Everything all right at home?" The question was casual, the look wasn't. I muttered something about deadlines and stress, and he nodded, satisfied, as if he had confirmed something, as if reminding me that he knew more than he should. The doubt followed me everywhere. Into meetings, into conversations, into the quiet moments I used to trust. I found myself watching my wife the way you watch a stranger, studying expressions, tone, pauses, searching for something solid to hold on to. And every time I tried to speak again, I stopped myself. Because being told you're imagining things does something to you. It doesn't just dismiss the question, it poisons the questioner. It makes you afraid of your own instincts. It makes you wonder if the problem isn't what you saw, but who you are. One night, standing alone in the bathroom, I barely recognized the man in the mirror. He looked tired, smaller somehow, a man second-guessing his own reality. That's when it finally hit me. The worst betrayal isn't cheating, it's being made to feel crazy for seeing the truth. I stopped asking questions after that. I stopped explaining myself. Stopped seeking reassurance that never came. Instead, I watched. I didn't go looking for the truth. That's what I told myself afterward, at least. That it found me on its own. That I had been patient, respectful, silent, and fate had decided silence deserved an answer. It happened on an ordinary evening, the kind of evening that lulls you into believing nothing important will change. My wife was in the shower, the sound of running water filling the apartment. Her phone lay on the bedside table, face down like it had been for weeks. It buzzed once, then again. I didn't move at first. I told myself not to. I wasn't that man, the one who invaded privacy, who searched for sins he wasn't sure existed. My chest felt tight, my palms damp. The phone buzzed a third time. Insistent, impatient, I picked it up. The screen lit up before I could stop myself. A name, Rohan. The message preview was short, careless. Enough. We need to be careful. He's starting to notice. Something inside me dropped so suddenly I felt dizzy. My fingers shook as I unlocked the phone, not with some dramatic guess. Not with desperation, but because I already knew the code. She had never changed it. Maybe she never thought she'd need to. The messages opened like a wound. There was no single explosive confession. No explicit declarations of love. What made it unbearable was how normal it all felt. The familiarity, the inside jokes, the planning hidden between work updates, late-night messages disguised as concern, apologies followed by reassurance, power softened by intimacy. My stomach turned. I had to sit down before my legs gave out. Flashbacks collided violently with the present. Her silence after the gala, the guarded smiles, the rehearsed conversations, Rohan's sudden generosity, his careful dominance, all of it rearranged itself into a picture so clear it hurt to look at. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was ongoing. The room felt too small. I pressed my back against the wall, breathing shallowly, as if too much air would make it worse. My hands trembled uncontrollably. A wave of nausea rose so fast I barely made it to the sink. I stared at my reflection, eyes bloodshot, face pale. The man looking back at me seemed frozen between disbelief and devastation. Another message caught my eye, an audio file. I don't remember deciding to play it. I only remember the sound of his voice filling the room. Calm, confident, familiar. "You don't have to worry," Rohan said softly. "I'll handle things on my end. He won't do anything. Men like him don't." My chest constricted. My ears rang. Her voice followed, quieter, hesitant, but not resistant. "I don't want this to get messy," she said. "It won't," he replied. "You trust me, don't you?" The recording ended there. I slid down to the floor, my back against the cabinet, my head in my hands. My body felt numb, like pain had overloaded every nerve at once and shut them all down. The truth was no longer a suspicion, it was heavy, undeniable, crushing. This wasn't a moment of weakness. This wasn't confusion. This was a choice. And worse, this was power being used deliberately. A boss who knew exactly what he was doing, who knew my position, my silence, my fear, who leaned into it, who used his authority not just to control my career, but to invade my life. And my wife, my partner, my constant had let him. She had paused, she had considered, and she had continued. The shower stopped. I heard the water shut off, the faint sound of movement down the hallway. I locked the phone and placed it back exactly where it had been, my hand steady now in a way that scared me. When she walked into the bedroom, towel around her shoulders, she smiled at me, the same familiar smile, the one that used to mean home. I couldn't return it. I stood there, alone in a room that no longer felt like mine, carrying a truth too large to speak, yet too real to ignore. The silence I had been living in finally shattered, not with noise, but with clarity. And in that moment, as everything settled into place, one thought rose above all the others, sharp and absolute. I lost my marriage before I lost my job. I didn't raise my voice when I finally spoke. That seemed to confuse her more than anger ever could. We sat across from each other at the dining table, the same place where we had shared meals, laughter, plans for a future that now felt like it belonged to strangers. I folded my hands, steady, deliberate, and looked at her the way one looks at something fragile that has already cracked. "I know," I said. She blinked. "Know what?" I didn't repeat myself. I didn't accuse. I simply held her gaze. Silence stretched between us, thick and unbearable. I watched it register slowly, the shift in her breathing, the way her shoulders stiffened, the instinctive reach for denial that never quite made it to her lips. "How much?" she asked quietly. "All of it." Her face crumpled in a way that might have moved me once. She spoke quickly after that, words tumbling over each other like they could bury the truth if she said enough of them. She talked about pressure, about confusion, about feeling invisible, about how it just happened, how it wasn't supposed to go this far. I listened. That was the cruelest part for her. I think that I listened without interrupting, without arguing, without trying to correct the story into something I could survive. When she ran out of explanations, she looked at me like someone waiting for a verdict. "Say something," she whispered. "I already did." I replied. I listened. Tears slid down her cheeks. She apologized then. Real apologies this time, not deflections or half-answers. She told me she never meant to hurt me, that she felt trapped, that Rohan had influence, power, the ability to make things difficult. If she said no, and you still chose to say yes, I said, not cruelly, just honestly. Her silence answered that for her. I felt the pain then, sharp and undeniable, but it didn't control me. It sat heavy in my chest, a reminder of everything I had given and everything I had lost. I realized, with a strange clarity, that I was done begging for the truth, done asking for honesty from someone who had learned how to hide it so well. I won't fight you, I said finally, and I won't forgive what you won't fully own. She reached for my hand. I pulled it back. That night, I slept on the couch, not because I was unsure, but because I was done pretending proximity meant connection. The next morning, I walked into work carrying more than just my laptop. Rohan was in his office when I arrived, reviewing something on his screen, looking every bit the composed executive he always was. He smiled when he saw me, that familiar expression of casual authority. Morning, he said. You wanted to see me? Yes, I replied, closing the door behind me. I didn't sit. I didn't fidget. I placed my phone on his desk and pressed play. His own voice filled the room. The color drained from his face so fast it was almost satisfying. I watched him calculate how much I knew, what I might do, how much power he still held. When the recording ended, he leaned back in his chair, forcing a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. You're making a mistake, he said. You don't want to do this. I already did, I replied. For the first time since I'd known him, Rohan looked unsure. I slid a folder onto his desk. Screenshots, messages, dates, context, enough to make things very uncomfortable for a lot of people if it ever left that room. I'm not here to negotiate, I said. I'm not asking for anything. Then what do you want? He asked. I met his gaze. To walk out with my dignity? I handed him my resignation letter. His mouth opened slightly, closed. He nodded once, slowly, as if accepting a move he hadn't anticipated. I turned and walked out of the office without another word, the weight on my chest lighter than it had been in weeks. I didn't know what would happen next, whether the evidence would surface, whether consequences would follow, but I knew this much as the elevator doors closed behind me. I was no longer his employee. I was no longer her illusion. I was a man who knew the truth, and chose himself anyway. The fire didn't end when I walked out of that office. It followed me home. The days that came after were quieter than I expected, and somehow heavier because of it. There were no dramatic phone calls, no shouting matches, no public unraveling. The marriage didn't explode, it collapsed inward, slowly, like a structure that had already been hollow for too long. We spoke in short sentences, practical ones. Who would take what, when one of us would move out? There were tears, yes, but they felt delayed, as if grief itself had grown tired. One morning, I packed a suitcase and left the apartment that no longer felt like mine. I didn't look back. Not because it didn't hurt, but because looking back felt like reopening a wound that had finally stopped bleeding. The workplace changed overnight. My resignation spread faster than truth ever does. Whispers replaced greetings. Messages went unanswered. A few colleagues avoided my eyes entirely, as if betrayal were contagious. Others offered awkward sympathy without asking questions they didn't want the answers to. Rohan remained where he was. Power has a way of insulating itself. Stories soften, details blur. Blame drifts toward the one who leaves instead of the one who stays. I understood that now. I wasn't naive enough to expect justice-only distance. Friends surprised me the most. Some stood by me quietly, without commentary or judgment. Others faded away, choosing comfort over complication. A few asked questions that felt more like accusations than concern. And some people I had trusted for years said nothing at all. That silence hurt more than outright rejection. Nights were the hardest. In borrowed rooms and unfamiliar spaces, silence pressed in from all sides. There was no shared breathing in the dark, no familiar rhythm of another presence. Just my thoughts loud, relentless, merciless. I replayed everything. The gala, the whisper, the messages. The moment I realized my life had already shifted before I had the words to stop it. Shame crept in during those hours. Quiet and poisonous. Shame for not seeing it sooner. Shame for staying silent too long. Shame for loving someone who chose differently. It took time to understand that the shame wasn't mine. Betrayal has a way of trying to settle into the wrong body. It convinces you that being hurt means being weak, that being loyal means being foolish, that trusting someone is a flaw. I fought those thoughts the same way I fought sleep, slowly, imperfectly, one night at a time. Starting over felt humiliating at first. New routines, new spaces, new plans formed without the person I had built my life around. Every small decision, what to eat, where to go, how to spend the evening, felt heavier without shared context. But with the weight came clarity. No more guessing, no more half-answers, no more shrinking myself to fit someone else's silence. I began to notice the absence of constant tension, the relief of not having to watch words, gestures, moods. The quiet no longer screamed as often. Some nights, it even felt peaceful. One evening, sitting alone with a cup of tea that had gone cold, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't broken. I was wounded. Yes, exhausted, altered, but intact. The man I was before the fire hadn't survived it, but the man left behind was standing on his own feet, finally seeing the ground beneath him. I looked out the window at the city lights, steady and indifferent, and made a promise not to anyone else, but to myself. I won't let betrayal define the rest of my life. Months had passed since the smoke of that collapse had cleared, and with time came distance and perspective. I was no longer the man who had walked into that office, chest tight with disbelief, or the one who had lain awake at night, replaying a whisper that had rewritten my life. I was different now, sharper, quieter, but stronger. Not because I had forgotten, but because I had learned how to live in a world where trust could break without warning. My days had taken on a rhythm that belonged to me alone. I had found a new career path, one that demanded effort but gave me control. I was no longer answering to someone whose power over me had been leveraged like a weapon. Every morning, I left the apartment with a sense of ownership over my own decisions. A rare freedom that I hadn't realized I had been missing. Work no longer defined my worth. I defined it myself. The solitude that had once felt unbearable became my greatest teacher. I learned the quiet strength of boundaries. I learned how to say no without apology. I learned how to listen to myself, without the noise of external expectations or deceit clouding my judgment. I built walls, yes, but walls that protected, not imprisoned. I learned that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispers in the steadiness of a life carefully reclaimed. I thought a lot about love, the kind I had once trusted blindly, about how easily silence can enable betrayal, how omissions and evasions can erode intimacy more effectively than outright lies. I thought about the years of my life I had spent bending myself, shrinking my needs, hoping loyalty alone would safeguard me. It hadn't. And yet, that knowledge didn't make me bitter. It made me wiser. It made me cautious without becoming cynical. I reflected on self-respect, something I had lost sight of when I had tolerated half-truths, vague denials, and quiet manipulations. I realized that honoring myself wasn't about retaliation. It wasn't about revenge. It was about knowing my worth, protecting it, and refusing to surrender it to people who treated it as negotiable. Every step I took now, every decision I made, carried that understanding. Sometimes I caught myself walking past mirrors and smiling at the reflection, recognizing the man looking back, not the man who had been broken in pieces, but the one who had rebuilt himself carefully, intentionally, from every shard left behind. There was pride in that, not arrogance, but quiet satisfaction. One evening, as I sat in a small cafe watching the city hum beneath fading sunlight, I felt it. A release, subtle yet undeniable. A weight I hadn't realized I had carried for so long lifted, leaving room for something softer peace. For the first time in what felt like years, endings didn't feel like loss. Endings felt like survival. Some endings save you. And in that moment, I finally understood. If you're hearing this, then maybe you've felt it too, the quiet suspicion that grows in your chest, the whisper of doubt that won't leave you alone. Maybe you stayed silent longer than you should have, hoping things would just work out. I know that feeling. I lived it, and I learned something you need to hear. Your instincts are rarely wrong. Trust them, even when it feels easier to ignore the signs. Even when love convinces you that your fear is paranoia. If respect is gone, if boundaries are crossed, if someone you trusted repeatedly chooses others over you, live, not angrily, not in revenge, but decisively, with dignity, with the knowledge that your worth does not depend on someone else's decisions. Courage isn't loud. Courage isn't dramatic. Sometimes it's the quiet choice to walk away when everyone else expects you to stay, to reclaim yourself before someone else writes your story for you, to honor your own boundaries, your own heart, your own life. That's strength. That's survival. That's freedom. If this story touched you, don't stay silent. Share it. Someone out there needs the courage you're about to give them. Leave a comment if you've ever faced betrayal, or a moment where standing up for yourself felt impossible. Like this video if you believe in self-respect over compromise. Subscribe to hear more real stories of heartbreak, strength, and survival, because no one should face these battles alone. Remember this: betrayal broke my marriage, but it built the man I became.